against ethnic. I cherish the idea of a new South Africa, where all South Africans are equal.
As the world remembers Nelson Mandela on what would have been his 104th birthday, we examine his life and legacy on this International Mandela Day. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. South Africa and the world still face challenges that were there during Nelson Mandela's life, including racial intolerance, income inequality, hunger, and food security. But on this day, we take a step back to look at his legacy and the long road to freedom. Known as the father of the nation, Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first president after the nation's first fully democratic elections in 1994. As leader of the African National Congress, the continent's oldest liberation group, he was instrumental in bringing down the racist white minority government. Mandela was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with former President F.W. de Klerk for their efforts in dismantling South Africa's apartheid system. Mandela, born in Transkei in southeastern South Africa, joined the ANC in 1942. For 2 decades, he led a campaign of civil disobedience against the white government. In 1956, he was arrested with 150 others and charged with treason. They were eventually acquitted, but he continued his political activism. He later became disillusioned with the peaceful campaign to change the system and embraced an armed struggle to overthrow the white government. In 1963, he was brought to trial again with 10 other ANC leaders on charges of sabotage. They were all sentenced to life in prison. Mandela was incarcerated at the prison on Robben Island off the South African city of Cape Town. He spent 18 of his 27 years as a political prisoner on Robben Island. Mandela was released in 1990 and subsequently led the ANC to victory in the elections of 1994. He retired from national politics in 1999 and made his last public appearance at the opening of the World Cup soccer tournament in South Africa in 2010. There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Angelo Coppola covers Southern Africa for CGTN. Lawson Naidu is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Also with us is Violwetu Zungula. He's President of the African Transformation Movement and a member of the South African Parliament. And Ibrahim Rasool served as South Africa's ambassador to the United States. He first met Nelson Mandela when they were both in prison. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Ambassador, as I said, you were part of the struggle against apartheid. You were imprisoned. In fact, you were held in solitary confinement for some time. You met Nelson Mandela while both of you were in prison. Tell us about that first meeting.
Thank you very much, Anand. I think the important point is that Nelson Mandela had been moved as a lifer to Pollsmoor prison when he contracted TB. I got detained under the emergency regulations and was moved to Pollsmoor after a while in solitary confinement. And then one day, a warden came and said that I must go to the hospital. I protested, but I went with him, and in the hospital, in the waiting room, was Nelson Mandela. I was surprised. He knew who I was. He knew that I was with a lot of children in prison. He inquired about all of that. He expressed his admiration for the struggle we were busy with. And then he arranged for his projector that he had as a privilege to be sent to us on a Saturday evening from that point onwards in order to ease the burden of the young detainees who were with me. And I'm speaking about children no older than 12. That changed just political admiration for a man into political commitment to the ideals and the values which he stood for. And that was a seminal moment in my life. And I think I have dedicated myself to really taking the lessons of Nelson Mandela to whichever part of the world I'm capable of taking it. So that really is a small story that happened in 1987 under the state of emergency.
Right, and Ambassador, you talk about the lessons you took from Nelson Mandela. He was, of course, an icon for liberation movements across the world. he brought this very strong sense of justice and morality to the struggle. What did you make initially of his leadership qualities? You have said before that it was very different in many respects from other leaders of the same kind. For instance, Martin Luther King, who fought for racial justice here in the United States.
Look, I think that for me, Nelson Mandela was that balance between, for example, the passive resistance and the commitment to nonviolence that a Mahatma Gandhi had, and, for example, a Malcolm X, who said by all means necessary. And Nelson Mandela was neither a pacifist in the Gandhiist sense of the word, nor was he an out-and-out commitment to violence. He found that balance because he loved life, and he also knew that some things were worth fighting for. And so he led the negotiations for peace, but he was also previously the commander, the first commander of the ANC's guerrilla army. And I think that that shaped him. That was the humanity and the commitment to justice, but also a strategic appreciation of what was needed at what particular moment in the struggle for justice.
Lawson Naidu, when Nelson Mandela became president, he was very realistic about the challenges that the country faced. In fact, he wrote about them. He said, and I'm quoting here, "When apartheid ended, we faced the difficult task of reconstructing our shattered society and providing the most basic services for our people. We had to build schools and hospitals to provide housing and jobs," unquote. He also went on to talk about healing the country to deal with the abuse and damage that communities had faced. That was his dream for what became known as the Rainbow Nation. How did the country live up to that challenge?
Thank you, Anand. Yes, obviously when a democratic government took over in 1994, the ravages of apartheid and colonialism were there for all to see. And President Mandela recognized that it was going to be a long, hard road to reverse those inequalities, to provide a sense of dignity for the people of South Africa, and in particularly in terms of social services, of health, education, housing, and water and electricity supply and the like. This was always going to take a long time. And I think he started on a very realistic note that we would not be able to undo the scourge of years or centuries of colonialism and racial discrimination in South Africa overnight, but that it would take some time. And the programs that his government put in place, starting with the Reconstruction and Development Program in the early 1990s, sought to create a mechanism whereby South Africa could be turned into the country of his dreams, a united, non-racial country where everyone had the opportunity to live to their full potential. Unfortunately, 30 years, almost 30 years after the democracy, we're still seeing vast examples of inequality, of poverty, of joblessness, homelessness, and desperation amongst people in South Africa. So that dream is still very far away from where we are today.
And Lawson, going back to those early years, and if you look at the enormity of the task he faced, and given his stature as well, it was clear that there was no one who was going to fill those shoes immediately. Did he perhaps leave office too soon? Could the country have done with another term of Nelson Mandela?
Well, I think, he was very realistic. He was, he was still quite an old man when he came out of prison, and was an older man when he became president. And he recognized that he had played his role in seeing a relatively peaceful transition to democracy, to oversee the first democratic elections, and he served a full 5-year term as president, and he felt it was time his job was done, and it was time for others to take over, to hopefully follow in the lead that he had given, not just as president, but over the previous 40 or 50 years of his commitment to public service in South Africa. And that was the leadership he provided to us. And for a while, we followed through on that. But in recent years, I'm afraid we've departed very far from the vision and the kind of statesmanship and leadership that Mandela provided, not just to South Africa, but to oppressed people across the globe.
We all were to, of course, Mandela signed into law a new constitution for South Africa. That was a document that embodied the principles of equality and of justice. But he also said, and I'm quoting here again, he said, "As long as poverty and gross inequality persist in the world, none of us can truly rest. And if you look at South Africa today, Lawson was talking about some of that a moment ago. It is one of the most unequal countries in the world. 10% of the South African population owns 80% of the country's wealth. And the majority of the country's population of about 60 million still face serious hunger. What happened, in your view, to Mandela's dream?
I think with Mandela, notwithstanding the role that he played for a peaceful transition into democracy, he, however, failed on two fronts. The first one was to unite the ANC, which is his own organization, so that they may be able to live within his ideals and values. That is why you have an ANC now that is imploding. You've got an ANC, the ruling party, that is self-centered, that is not committed to living to the ideals of Nelson Mandela. Also on the government front, the transition into democracy, as peaceful as it was, but it did not address the structural design of our country, from the economic ownership, land ownership in our country, and racism. So what we are seeing currently, where South Africa is the most unequal country, it is because of the lack of transformation that we've witnessed for the past 28, 29 years, lack of transformation in the economy, lack of transformation in terms of land ownership, lack of transformation in terms of dealing with the demon called racism.
Angelo Coppola, here's the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, talking about the challenges the country faces today. Let's listen to him.
For those of a certain age, we remember the moment we placed a cross on a ballot paper for the first time in our lives. We cannot be a nation of free people when so many people still live in poverty. We cannot be a nation of free people when funds that are meant for the poor are wasted, when funds are lost, when funds meant for the poor are stolen. We cannot regard ourselves as a nation that is free when there is still corruption within our own country.
So, Angelo, as a reporter working in South Africa, and you've covered the country for a very long time, what is your assessment of the state of the nation today?
I would guess it would have to be Ramaphosa is trying to refloat a sinking ship. He's got an issue with corruption, as he's mentioned. He's got an issue with poverty, which he's mentioned as well. But he's not admitting that the problem is within the ANC, obviously and openly enough. And he's not showing any effort in terms of prosecuting or putting those people who are, like with the Zondo Commission, being found to be wanting in terms of their integrity and their values and their access to capital. So, state of the nation as it stands today is Mandela would probably be crying in his grave, turning in his grave possibly quite now. And also, if somebody doesn't get prosecuted quite soon, it's going to be a problem, because we have the Zondo Commission with all those recommendations and we're not seeing enough movement. We're seeing a little bit of movement here and there, but not enough and not fast enough. It's been 4 years of Zondo, and everything's going to hinge on whether those recommendations are implemented or not. So while I seem to be putting a lot of emphasis on Zondo, it is a key moment in our history, and one that can be made to work and to show commitment from the government in terms of their changing or their ability to put their colleagues on the spot in terms of the courts.
Right, and when you talk about Zondo, Angelo, you're talking about the Zondo Commission there that looked into corruption in South Africa, into what became known as state capture. Ambassador Rasool, listening to what Angelo said there about the ANC, of course, this is the party of Nelson Mandela. Have the successors to Nelson Mandela actually put party above country?
I think very clearly the party has become more dominant than it should have been But what gives me comfort is that Nelson Mandela in his presidency and his generation had crafted a constitution. And one of the critical quotes of Nelson Mandela that I remember that went into the writing of that constitution was that fundamental rights and fundamental values need to be inscribed in that constitution, and in his words, and put out of the reach of temporary majorities. What he meant by that is that no incumbent government must ever be able to shift the fundamental character of our constitution. And therefore, while I share Angelo's pessimism about the leadership ability, I don't share a sense that the constitution is impotent. I think it is that constitution that we are using to establish a Zondo Commission, to be able to negotiate extradition treaties, to be able to prosecute people, to be able to have a judiciary that is impartial and activist, to be able to have an investigative journalism, and to have an activist civil society. And that is what I think could be our saving grace in that Nelson Mandela has given us.
Right, and Ambassador, when you talk about fundamental values, I mean, just let's look at one of them. Let's talk about the rule of law in South Africa. If we look at the level of corruption in the country, and we look at the institutions like, you know, justice in South Africa, I mean, have they failed the country? Are there people in South Africa who regard themselves as above the law? You know, has the country in essence become an unequal society?
I think that there are people who have institutionalized impunity in this country. I think when number one in the country, in this case Jacob Zuma, finds himself in impunity, he could do what he wants to, then number 55 million also feels that they can be with impunity in terms of traffic laws, for example. And I think that we are facing this crucial intersection at this moment, and I am hoping that the president realizes that it is more than the unity of the ANC, that the unity of the ANC in fact needs to be preceded by the renewal of the ANC, and if it is not, then it must be the obliteration of the ANC. But certainly, I think that we need to re-establish the rule of law, and we need to turn back the culture of impunity that has institutionalized itself, but I retain enough faith in the Constitution to be able to do it. It just needs new advocates for that Constitution that can activate what needs to be activated.
Lawson Naidoo, do you have faith in the Constitution? Because you've been sharply critical of the ANC government. Of course, this is the government that has been running South Africa since that first democratic election in 1994. You've written about it, and you say the country has descended into an abyss, forcing the state to the precipice of a fiscal cliff. What would Nelson Mandela say of South Africa today?
Well, I think he'd be very disappointed in the state of the country today, the state of, the lack of social cohesion, the lack of a vision for overcoming the challenges that we face. And whilst I agree with Ambassador Rasool that the Constitution has proven to be a very important tool, but largely we've had to resort to using it as a defensive shield against government and preventing government from taking away rights. Whereas its true purpose and Mandela's vision was that the Constitution would be a torchbearer and provide a framework for creating a better society for South Africans in the future. And to that extent, we have failed to implement that Constitution as South Africans, and particularly as government. And I think, we speak about corruption and so on it. One of the most despicable acts I think we could have imagined was that at Nelson Mandela's funeral 9 years ago when he passed on, there was a huge corruption scandal with people looting public funds that were intended for Mandela's funeral. That's the depths to which we've stooped as a country, and it says a lot about where we are. And whilst prosecutions of those implicated in state capture and corruption are important, I think we need to recognize that there has been some progress in that regard. Some arrests have been made, and we certainly need to see a lot more of that. But I think it's not all doom and gloom on the prosecution's front either.
Vilwertu, there are those people who will say that it's not totally the fault of the current government in South Africa, that much of what ails the country right now is actually a legacy of apartheid. There are also those who will say, look, the constitution that South Africa has, it's a very liberal constitution, but that constitution initially gave away too much to white South Africans, or as they sometimes refer to as white monopoly capital. Do they have a point?
They are 100% correct, because everyone knows that the Constitution and how it came about as a compromise between the freedom fighters of the day as well as the white minority that was negotiating for a settlement that would appease them. That is why after the 1994 elections, you find that majority of white-owned businesses, they thrived. White-owned, the white minority have pretty much settled. So the root of our problems are in the structural design of our country, the economy, the land ownership, etc. And what transpired in the early 90s was a compromise which did not benefit the black majority. However, it was a compromise that somewhat kept the white minority appeased. So without dealing with those fundamentals of land ownership, of the structuring of the economy, these problems are going to persist.
Lawson, what do you make of that assessment?
Well, I would fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think the Constitution can be blamed for the inequalities in our country, for the lack of economic growth, the high levels of joblessness and poverty that we see. As I said just now, the Constitution provided us with a roadmap to create a society that was more equal, that provided more opportunities for all of its people. And unfortunately, the responsibility for that lies squarely with the government, not with the Constitution, which has become a very convenient political football. But, I'm not sure what you can point to in the Constitution that gave away rights to either white South Africans or to white monopoly capital. It is the persistent failure of successive governments to implement socio-economic measures that address the plight of South Africans that is at fault, and not the Constitution. As Ambassador Rasool and I just said, the Constitution has been the saving grace for South Africa, particularly in recent years, where the rule of law has withstood the stresses that it was put through. The independence of our judiciary came to the fore to protect the rights of ordinary South Africans.
Angelo Coppola, despite the enormous poverty that we see in South Africa, the inequality, the breakdown in law and order, would it be fair to say that South Africa is still a vibrant democracy? The will of the people still matters. Mandela's vision for a non-racial, free South Africa, one man, one vote, survives.
In short, I'm undecided. I'm not entirely certain that that is true. I wonder because people are living in poverty, people are living on the streets, people are living without any means of making money, of making a living, of looking after their families. And once we get that done, once we get that sorted, once we can build an economy, maybe then we can work towards being free and fair and all those other wonderful attributes that are in our Constitution. But until there's some economic growth, we're going to sit in a situation where we are right now, where it's uncertain, it's vibrant, but I don't think it's a vibrant country. I think it's vibrant in terms of democracy a little bit maybe, but not for those 20 or 30 million odd people who are unemployed. There's no vibrancy there, and democracy doesn't mean anything to them at all.
Wilberto, what are your hopes for the future? Now, I was looking at one particular metric in South Africa, and that was the unemployment rate. The national rate of unemployment is almost 35%. But when we look at that figure for the country's youth, for those people aged between 15 and 24, it goes up to a very alarming 64%.
What we're hoping for the future, firstly, it is to have leaders in our country that basically love the citizens of our country, because that's all it takes. It is political will from the leadership to actually do what is right for the citizens and prioritize the needs of the citizens instead of prioritizing their own narrow, selfish needs. And there must be leadership that could be practical when it comes to approaches to deal with the unemployment problem. For example, in our country, we've got high levels of unemployment. However, we are still not having a government that is deliberate on producing local goods, South Africa being a manufacturing hub, so jobs could be created. We are basically a dumping point of goods coming from China and other far parts of the world. And if you look at the trajectory of other countries where they tend away from being the dumping space for China, for goods produced in China, and became their own producers of the goods they use in their own countries. So basically, that is the approach that we would want to see as the ATM, where South Africa truly reverses what is happened, because if the current trajectory continues, we're going to see more of what we saw last year, where there was instability, because the root cause of that instability last year, it was poverty, unemployment. Therefore, that is why you hope to have a change of heart, the leadership to have a change of heart, so that it can best serve the people.
Ambassador Rasool, I've just got a little bit of time left, but if we look at Nelson Mandela, he of course was a leader of very high moral standing, enormous courage and strength, and he was a champion of non-racial justice, not just in South Africa, but around the world. And looking at the world today, when we see so much racism, so much inequality, so much poverty, never-ending wars, doesn't the world need another Nelson Mandela? I mean, how big a void did he leave?
I think the saddest thing about what has happened to South Africa, this leadership crisis that Vuyolwethu speaks about, it's a failure of leadership to carry on this legacy of Nelson Mandela, to be a moral beacon to the world, to be a pioneer for societies troubled by conflict, by poverty, by inequality, by racism and discrimination and so forth. That was what Nelson Mandela and South Africa represented at its finest moment. It was also giving methods of struggle to people that were not self-defeating. And I think the saddest thing out of the legacy of Nelson Mandela is that people now need to reproduce Nelson Mandelas in their own societies, whereas that is a phenomenon that comes once in a generation, even once in a lifetime. And I think that it is now going to be up to individual South Africans to be able to give that kind of strategic and principled wisdom and leadership to the world. And I must say, in conclusion, I was pessimistic about the nature of our deal that we made up to '94. I saw the wisdom of it when I was in the front row of the Arab Springs, and I saw how they, unlike Nelson Mandela, who prioritized to push back counter-revolution, where they went for all the ideals all at once, and they were defeated by counter-revolution and the return of the authoritarians. So I think we must put it down to human and leadership failure in South Africa, together with the legacy of apartheid that we had, and I think a last decade of absolute impunity in South Africa. But Nelson Mandela should not be judged as a failure just because those who followed him failed him.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.